CEO panics as system begins to collapse. Suddenly, a gatekeeper's child walks in. Everyone shocked while most 8-year-olds are learning multiplication or playing dodgeball during recess. Annika spends her days in near silence repairing old cassette players, sketching out circuit ideas in the back of a dog-eared notebook, and riding the city tram with her mother to the tall, cold office towers of Aegis Systems in downtown Helsinki. Annika is invisible, not just to the polished workers with their sleek badges and pressed suits, but to the entire world. No one sees her. No one except the system. And when a devastating cyberattack brings Aegis to a grinding halt, it's not the senior developers, not the crisis response managers, not the cybersecurity veterans who grasp what's going on. It's Annika. And when she quietly asks if she can try something quietly, irrevocably shifts. How does a child the world forgot become the one to save it? And what happens when a powerful CEO meets someone he can't explain away? Stay with us. This is a story about how brilliance grows in silence and how being seen, truly seen, can change everything. Annika always walked exactly 5 steps behind her mother, not because anyone told her to, but because she liked watching how her mother moved. There was something graceful about the way she carried herself through places that clearly didn't welcome her. Her mother never rushed, never tried to blend in. She moved through the steel and glass hallways of Aegis Systems with a kind of quiet defiance. She didn't belong, and she made no effort to pretend otherwise. Annika had learned young that being invisible was a form of power, especially in spaces where your presence was barely tolerated. Her backpack was old, its zipper nearly useless, but she kept it hugged tight to her chest. Inside, her notebook, a busted digital watch she'd nearly fixed, and a cracked USB stick that didn't work anymore, but still felt important. She didn't know why, only that she couldn't part with it. When they came in through the service entrance, the security guard never looked at her. He barely looked at her mom, 47. Her mother muttered. That meant same floor, same shift. Annika nodded and peeled away without a word, sliding onto the soft bench near the far end of the lobby like she always did. She pulled out her notebook, flipped past pages of scrawled circuitry and mock command lines, and began sketching. This was her favorite time of day, the moment she could pretend she belonged in a place like this. By the time her mother disappeared behind the elevators, Annika was halfway into a new circuit design, this one a wireless transmitter that could detect frequency dips in nearby devices. She'd seen something like it once on a YouTube tech channel she wasn't supposed to watch. She didn't understand it fully, but the idea had latched onto her. She imagined how the device would work, a board that could decode interrupted data packets. Her pencil worked quickly, sketching the imagined logic flow. Round her, the rhythm of the building buzzed, heels clicking, muffled conversations, tablets opening and shutting, cappuccino machines hissing. She blocked all of it out. What mattered was the page. And then, without warning, the lights above dimmed. She froze, blinked. Then, almost in unison, the massive reception screens flickered once and went black, like a roomful of eyes slamming shut. Annika didn't move. Years of practice had taught her, you stay still when chaos begins. The moment people see you, they remember to send you away. So she sat quiet, alert. She watched. The murmurs turned to voices. The voices climbed to panic. Phones came out, fingers swiped desperately. Somewhere near the front desk, a man slammed his tablet down. We're what? Locked out, he shouted into his Bluetooth headset. A woman in a navy suit muttered something about remote override protocols failing. Annika didn't know her job, but her tone told the story. Things were bad, very bad. The entire lobby, once sleek and serene, now buzzed with unraveling. Annika sat still as a stone, watching, listening. She wasn't hearing words, she was absorbing patterns. Someone by the elevators said something about a kernel-level breach. Another whispered malware vector. That one she knew. Malware. She had read about it. Watched hackers run demo attacks on simulated systems. She didn't understand all the infrastructure, but she knew panic when she saw it. And this panic wasn't about something crashing. It was about something invading. She started scribbling. In the margins of her sketch.client presentation, that phrase kept popping up. "This can't be happening, not today," someone said. A younger guy with messy hair and a jacket to sizes too big kept repeating, "He's gonna kill us. We're dead. We're so dead." Annika's pencil tapped the page. They were reacting, trying things, running standard diagnostics, but none sounded like they knew. Her hand tightened around her pencil. That realization hit her hard. They were guessing. She wasn't. She turned to a blank page and began outlining what she'd try. Isolate breach points, internal or external, run diagnostic shells, check traffic logs, scan for anomalies in handshake protocols. Her heart pounded. But it wasn't fear, it was electricity. She wasn't sure if she could fix it, but she was suddenly sure of something else. They couldn't. For the first time in her life, Annika felt the shift, like holding a lit match just above a sheet of paper. Dread, but also clarity. Not because she thought she was smarter, but because none of these suited-up adults even knew where to start. She glanced up at the big black screen near the front desk. Nothing. Still dark. And then another wave of voices. They locked out every remote recovery. Pinged our DNS. Servers nothing. We're blocked at root. Annika stared down at her notebook. The notes began to form themselves, not like a plan, but like a map. Then, from the hallway, a glass-walled conference room began to fill. Important-looking people in sleek jackets and worn hoodies filed in, whispering, arguing, pointing. One screen showed a digital map. Every node was red. It pulsed like blood. Annika stepped closer. She moved like a whisper. No one noticed her. No one ever did. She pressed herself against the wall just outside the room, watching the arguments swirl. "This can't be internal," barked a large man with a Finnish accent. "We triple firewalled the Helsinki root node after the Oslo incident. It's mimicking clean behavior," another countered. "Too precise to be brute force." Annika didn't understand all of it, but she understood what was missing. They weren't asking the right questions. She knew that feeling to, well, people chasing the obvious leads, missing the thing hiding in plain sight. A young man near the back tried a manual override. His fingers flew. Blocked. Level for loop. "Who even builds this crap?" "Someone who wants us offline," another muttered. That's when Annika's voice left her before she could catch it. She didn't mean to speak. It just escaped. "Have you checked the socket overflow loop?" The room froze. It was quiet. Then someone chuckled. What did she say? Another rolled his eyes. Who let a kid in here? But one woman didn't laugh. She just looked at Annika. Thoughtfully, carefully, and Annika immediately regretted saying anything. She stepped back, cheeks burning, heart pounding. Don't get noticed. That was the rule. And then she saw him, a boy barely older than a university student, standing by the wall. He was watching her, not with irritation, with curiosity. His badge read Leo. He tilted his head. He'd heard what she said and he was thinking about it. He didn't speak, but Annika felt it. He didn't look at her like a mistake. He looked at her like a piece of the puzzle. And suddenly, Annika wasn't invisible anymore. She was a variable. One they hadn't accounted for. Annika wasn't sure what she'd done. She hadn't meant to speak. It wasn't part of her plan. She was supposed to be quiet, supposed to be background, supposed to disappear. But now, she had their attention, or at least Leo's. He hadn't looked away since she spoke. Inside the glass-walled war room, the conversations hadn't stopped. But something had changed. The skepticism was still there, but so was tension of another kind, uncertainty. "She's just a kid," someone snapped. Another voice pushed back. "Yeah, but she asked something specific." Leo stepped forward, slow and calm, like someone walking out into a storm. "She mentioned the socket overflow loop," he said, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "If the breach is recursive, and the overflow wasn't patched correctly during the last system update, it's a reasonable place to start." "You're serious?" the man with the thick accent barked. "You're taking technical cues from a child now." Leo didn't flinch. "I'm saying none of us has found anything better." The silence that followed felt like a power outage. Quiet, yes, but charged. Someone finally muttered, "What have we got to lose?" Annika's heart pounded in her ears. Her hand tightened around the notebook. She didn't speak again. She didn't need to. A few minutes later, they let her in. Not because they believed her, but because they had nothing left. The IT director, a tall, narrow-eyed man with thinning hair and a Nordic sarcasm that couldn't hide his panic, sighed dramatically. Fine. Maybe the janitor's kid can do what our whole division couldn't. No one laughed. Not anymore. Leo walked over, grabbed a chair, and dragged it toward the main terminal. It's a bit tall, he said quietly. You might need to stand on it. Annika nodded, pulled her hoodie sleeves up, and climbed onto the seat. No one told her what to do. No one explained the problem. They didn't expect her to do anything at all, which was their first mistake. She didn't touch the keyboard for a full 10 seconds. She just looked. The screen was a digital jungle. Half-open command prompts, error codes, frozen diagnostic tools, 3 failed backdoor recoveries already attempted, each one blocked. Encryption walls layered over each other like scales. This wasn't just broken. It was booby-trapped. Annika took a slow breath. Then, her fingers moved. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't learning. She was remembering. The interface was different, but the patterns were familiar. She'd seen this before, or something like it, on a stolen bootleg of an OS debugging tool she'd gotten from a forgotten online forum. She started typing, not fast, not showy, just clean, deliberate. Leo stood close by, silent, his hands behind his back, not helping, just watching. One of the engineers leaned closer. Wait a sec, that key string, that's the CEO's private cipher. She's in the admin shell. Another gasp. Not of panic this time, but awe. That shouldn't even be visible without top-level credentials. She authenticated it manually. She what? Annika didn't answer. She wasn't listening to them. She was already 3 steps ahead. Her notes lay open beside her, untouched. She didn't need them anymore. She was moving through the system like someone who lived there. She wasn't trying to solve a puzzle. She was walking through a story, one only she understood. Marcus Algard, CEO of Aegis Systems, was 2 floors above in a boardroom filled with frozen investor calls and broken projections. He was staring at a dead tablet screen. His jaw was clenched. His assistant, a thin, pale boy who looked like he hadn't slept in days, stepped in nervously. Sir, there's someone working on the system. Marcus didn't look up. I thought we were locked out. We are, sir. But there's a girl in the lobby. She's, a janitor's daughter. Marcus blinked, then stood. He didn't ask any more questions. He just walked, fast, silent, down to flights, past the glass elevators, through the floor with the blinking red lights and shattered confidence. And when he reached the open incident room, he saw her, small, still typing, calm as winter. The others stood back. Even his most senior engineer was just watching now, frozen. Like everyone else. What is she doing? Marcus asked. No one answered. He moved closer, peered through the glass. His eyes narrowed. The girl's hoodie was too big, her sneakers worn down to the sole, her hair tied back in a lazy knot. But her hands didn't shake. Who is she? He asked again. Still no one answered. Leo stepped forward. Her name's Annika. That's all I know. You're letting a child play with a multi-million euro infrastructure system. She's already in deeper than we ever got, Leo replied. And she hasn't triggered a single failsafe. The room went still. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered. We tried everything. She's reversing the lockout. Marcus's jaw tensed. Security. He snapped. A guard started toward the door. Leo moved in front of Annika. You can't pull her off. She has no clearance. She's the only one who's doing anything. Marcus didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice was a blade. You're telling me that my entire cybersecurity division just surrendered to an 8-year-old? No, Leo said quietly. I'm telling you she's the first person who understood it. Annika didn't look up, didn't notice the argument behind her, didn't hear the disbelief. She was 4 layers deep now, decoding error logs and false paths. The attack wasn't random. It wasn't malicious either. It was personal. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. It wasn't a system smash. It was a system story. Breadcrumbs, decoys, traps, but not meant to keep everyone out, only most. The further she went, the more familiar it felt. Too familiar. Her fingers froze. One line of malformed syntax blinked on the screen. Her breath caught in her chest. She'd seen that before. Not recently, years ago, a code snippet from an old bootleg forum. She hadn't understood it back then, but it had stuck. In her brain, a fragment, now evolved but unmistakable. This wasn't just any attack. It was one made by someone like her. Someone self-taught. Someone alone. Someone who saw systems the way she did, as living puzzles. Annika's stomach twisted. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was tracing a system back to safety or walking into a message left just for her. Annika's fingers hovered over the keys, unmoving for a long breath. She wasn't stumped. She wasn't afraid of the code. She was afraid of what it meant. That malformed syntax, like a crooked signature, wasn't just a bug. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, clean, precise, and hauntingly familiar. This was a trail, a message maybe left not for anyone, but for someone like her. Someone who saw systems not as barriers or tools, but as stories, as bones of something deeper, something almost alive. Lena, Leo said softly from behind her. She didn't even flinch when he used her name wrong. You okay? She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed glued to the string of code in front of her. Yeah, she said quietly. Just thinking. He nodded, even though she couldn't see it. What is it? Her voice was soft, but steady. I think I know who made this. Leo blinked. What do you mean? I mean someone like me, she said, and this time, she looked up. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was heavy. Leo didn't try to comfort her. He didn't fill the space with tech jargon or adult logic. He just stood there and listened. And Annika kept going, slower now. Not because she didn't know what to do, but because it mattered now. Because the code wasn't just an attack. It was a conversation, a challenge, a whisper in her language. And someone had spoken it first. She traced the corrupted logic tree down to its roots, unraveling command injections and layered misdirections that had been designed to fool even the most advanced intrusion detection systems. It wasn't brute force. It wasn't noisy. It was elegant. Like someone had danced through the protocols. She had never seen anything like it. Except once. Years ago. It was a rainy night in the far suburbs of Helsinki. Annika had borrowed an old laptop from her cousin. Its screen flickered when tilted, and the battery had to be plugged into the wall at all times. She was supposed to be asleep. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the tile floor, the backlight glowing blue across her face. The website had no name, just a black screen with a flashing cursor and a string of cryptic links. She shouldn't have been able to access it. It had required bypassing a DNS lockout. She had. Inside, among the broken threads and abandoned code dumps, was one post that felt different. It was titled Symmetric Disruption, becoming the door. Just one file, no replies, a single line of commentary below. It's not about breaking in. It's about becoming the door no one sees. That night, she copied the script by hand. It made no sense then, but it had lived in the back of her mind ever since. And now, years later, it was here again. Evolved, upgraded, but unmistakable. Whoever launched this attack had seen that same post, or had written it, and they'd built something Annika instinctively understood because her mind moved the same way. Inside the glass room, the senior engineers were murmuring again. She's not triggering any lockouts. That key syntax. She just ran it bypassed layer 6. She's dissecting the recursive trap like it's a textbook. One man shook his head. She knows this structure. Leo leaned closer. She's following it like a path. Marcus stood in the back of the room, arms folded, unmoving. He didn't speak, didn't blink. He just stared at her. A kid, 8 years old, navigating a threat that had brought his company to its knees. She wasn't afraid. She was curious, and somehow that made her more dangerous than any hacker he'd ever met. The red glow on one of the large overhead screens flickered, then faded. It didn't reboot. It didn't beep. It just quietly went green. Everyone in the room turned. A few gasped. One woman actually dropped her tablet. Was that? She cracked a layer. She's reversing the stack. Marcus's jaw clenched. His eyes didn't leave her. Who is she? He whispered almost to himself. Leo answered quietly. Her name's Annika. No, I mean, who is she really? Back at the terminal, Annika leaned in. This wasn't about saving the company. This was about the story behind the system. This wasn't code written in panic. It was code written in pain and precision. Whoever did this hadn't lashed out in anger. They'd planned it. They knew the system, knew where it was weakest, where it would hurt. She thought of the little girl in the photo frame near the CEO's office, the one labeled Ella, 3:18 a.m., welcome to the world. She thought about how easily the attacker had bypassed the administrative shell, using a cipher built around that memory. This wasn't just sabotage. It was a message. Annika's mind reeled. For the first time, she wondered if she should stop, step back, let the adults take over. But the adults hadn't seen the trail. She had. And now she had to see where it ended. The engineers were whispering again. She's into the diagnostic root directory. She's patching the protocol anomalies manually. Why didn't we try that? Because they hadn't seen it. Because none of them thought like her. Because they didn't know how to read between the lines of code like it was poetry. Because they had all the credentials but none of the vision. Annika was writing with her fingers what her mind had already solved hours ago. She bypassed another security loop, running a custom patch line she wrote from scratch. The screen blinked once. Then again, the red filters faded from a second terminal screen. Green dot this time. No one made a sound. Even Leo just stood there, breath held, watching something impossible unfold. Marcus stepped forward, not to interrupt, just to see. He studied her hands, her posture, the absolute stillness of her body. Not from fear. From focus. There was no showmanship. No ego. Just truth. She didn't even seem aware they were watching, because she wasn't doing this for them. She was doing it because the system had spoken, and she'd understood it. Annika leaned forward, one foot shifting slightly on the edge of the chair to balance. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for just a second longer. Then she dove back into the breach. She was no longer responding to commands. She was navigating intent. This attack hadn't been random. It had learned the system, mirrored its pathways, crept into the shell structure disguised as normal operations. The code was like a ghost whispering through wires, camouflaged by routine. But Annika had learned a long time ago how to find patterns hiding in plain sight. She didn't look for what was broken. She looked for what didn't fit. At school, on the rare days she went, teachers told her she got distracted, too slow on basic drills, too fast on problems no one else could follow. They had no idea how her mind worked, no tests that measured her curiosity, no systems that welcomed her logic. But here, in the core of a crumbling digital architecture, she wasn't slow or strange or out of place. She was fluent. She scanned the latest batch of corrupted logs and traced a spike in activity from 48 hours ago, a nearly invisible handshake request that mimicked internal diagnostics. Only it had embedded a cloaked command structure into an unused admin gate. She recognized it not because of the syntax, but because of the timing. It had followed a pattern she'd seen only once before, in that old code dump years ago. That was the moment she knew. This wasn't just a ghost. This was a mirror. Someone had built this attack like a reflection only. Darker, colder, the same brilliance, twisted into a trap instead of a tool. She typed faster now, not panicking, translating. She didn't need to map the logic tree. She felt it. Behind her, Marcus hadn't moved. He stood beside Leo, arms still crossed, expression unreadable. "She's doing it," someone whispered. Leo glanced at Marcus. "She's not just fixing the system. She's reading it like it's talking to her." Marcus didn't answer. He couldn't. All he could think about was a memory he'd buried under decades of quarterly reports and boardroom deals. A girl from long ago. Not this one. Another. Years before Aegis systems ever existed. Marcus had spent time in a small group home near Abilene, a rural stretch in northern Finland. He was 10, angry, cold all the time. He didn't speak much, but there was a girl there. Quiet, greasy fingers, always sitting on the back steps with broken electronics in her lap, radios, CASSETTE players, anything she could find. She never talked unless it was about circuits. She once told him that broken things made more sense than people. And one day, she was just gone. No note, no goodbye, not even a missing report. Just gone. He never asked where she went. Never wanted to know. It was easier to forget. Until now. Until this. Because the way Annika sat, curved shoulders, unwavering. Hands, eyes that never asked for permission. That was her all over again. That was a ghost he thought he'd buried. Back in the room, Annika broke through another layer. She'd found at the heart of the recursive loop. A circular failsafe trigger disguised as a power draw log. Every time someone tried to restore the system, the command structure rerouted them to an artificial entry point 1 that looked open, but was actually sealed by false data triggers. She didn't override it. She bypassed it. She built her own door. She called the new entry point Echo 1, short for something only she understood. The screen blinked. A login window flashed across the command shell. Access granted. The second screen near the reception desk flickered to life. Then another dot. The room didn't erupt in cheers. No one clapped. They couldn't. They just watched. Stunned. A system they had declared lost was blinking back to life, one protocol at a time. Word traveled fast. Not through proper memos or alerts, but in breathless whispers passed between coffee cups and vibrating phones. The janitor's daughter was rebooting the core. It sounded like a joke. Until it wasn't. Until the screens stopped blinking red. Until the investor call that had frozen upstairs began to buffer. Until Aegis's internal servers quietly acknowledged their own recovery. Marcus turned to his assistant. "Where's your mother?" The assistant blinked. I think she's on the 47th floor. Still on shift." "Bring her down," Marcus said. Now. Annika hadn't looked up once since the screens came back online. Her eyes were focused on one last anomaly, an encrypted error path that led deeper into a subsystem labeled Root Echo. She knew what it was. A personal folder. Encrypted, empty on the surface. But not empty. Not to her. She cracked it open carefully, layer by layer. Not to expose, just to understand. Inside, a string of metadata with no file attached. No audio. No documents. Just this: "You saw it. Maybe you can do better." "I hope so." Her hands trembled for the first time. This wasn't sabotage. It was a test, and maybe a warning. When she finally stepped down from the chair, the room was still quiet. People shifted, cleared throats. One engineer muttered something about needing to verify recovery. No one moved toward her. No one dared. Then she felt a soft hand on her shoulder. "Leo, you okay?" he asked. She didn't answer, but she nodded. He didn't say good job. He didn't need to. She looked around, finally, at the adults in the room, the suits, the security, the engineers with coffee-stained badges. She hadn't just fixed their system. She'd seen it. All the way through. And for the first time in her life, they had seen her. The next morning, there was no press conference. No banner. No streamers. Just a quiet message passed to Annika's mother by the evening floor supervisor. One sentence, low and uncertain: "They'd like her to come in again, tomorrow morning, if she's willing." No details, no promises, just a request. Annika didn't hesitate. She packed her notebook, checked that her watch was still ticking, and patched the hole in her hoodie sleeve with electrical tape. She wore the same sneakers, the ones with the peeling sole. She didn't tell anyone what had happened. Didn't brag, didn't explain. This wasn't about recognition. It never had been. Her mother walked her to the entrance, but not all the way in. She stopped at the revolving glass doors, arms folded tight across her chest, like she was still trying to decide if this was real or some cruel misunderstanding. Annika glanced up, saw her mother's worry, and gave a small nod. She'd be okay. She walked in alone. They didn't put her in the lobby this time. A polite assistant with a company badge and a nervous smile led her through a hallway of frosted glass and brushed steel, past rows of sleek offices, until they reached a long conference room with a blue chair at the far end. Inside were 5 people. Not all of them she recognized. Leo sat near the middle, notebook in his lap, tapping his pen nervously. The woman who'd taken her seriously yesterday, the one who hadn't laughed, sat beside him. Across the table was Marcus Elgard. CEO. He looked tired, his sleeves rolled up, his jaw set. There were no introductions. No warm-up. The older woman leaned forward. "How did you do it?" she asked, voice steady, no judgment. "Just hunger for truth, for understanding." Annika blinked. Which part? That earned a few soft chuckles, not cruel ones this time, more like surprised admiration. The override, someone said, the subshell mapping, the error trap bypass, all of it. Annika's fingers curled around her pencil. She knew this moment, the one where adults asked a question but didn't really want an answer, only something that made sense to them. But no one interrupted. No one smirked. They waited. She looked around, unsure how to translate what she had felt into words, then quietly said, "I don't know how to explain it." She looked down, embarrassed. Then slowly pulled her notebook out. "But I can show you." The room went silent as her pencil scratched across the page. She didn't draw a network diagram. She didn't write code. She mapped her thinking, the way logic branches became loops, the way failure cascaded into recovery, the way she saw systems, not as rigid hierarchies but ecosystems. Circuits turned into trees. Data pulses became rivers. A recursion trap turned into a spiral she labeled with numbers and emotional states: false success, ghost redundancy, synthetic stillness. No one spoke. When she finished, she turned the page around and pushed it gently across the table. Marcus picked it up. Didn't ask what it meant. Didn't ask her to explain. He turned it slowly, studying. Not like an engineer, like someone trying to understand a dream. Leo leaned forward. "She doesn't think in layers," he murmured. "She thinks in shapes." Marcus nodded once, then looked at Annika, eyes soft but sharp. "This," he said, tapping the page. "This isn't just how you fixed our system." She blinked. He continued, "It's how you see." They didn't offer her a job. They didn't offer her a scholarship. Not yet. Marcus just slid a small white card across the table. A badge, AEGIS Systems, access, full, name Annika, nitrogen monoxide title. She picked it up, turned it over once, then looked up. "You can come in tomorrow," Marcus said. "Or next week. Or next year. The lab's yours when you're ready." Annika held the badge tight in her hand. "I'll come tomorrow," she said. The ride home was silent. Her mother clutched her purse so tight the handles bent. She didn't speak until they reached their apartment door. Then she turned to Annika and asked, voice cracking, "Did you break anything?" Annika nodded. "A few things." Her mother closed her eyes, then opened them again. "Good." Marcus didn't go back to his office right away. He rode in silence to a quiet alley in southern Helsinki, a residential zone filled with tenement flats and satellite dishes clinging to windows like barnacles. He didn't bring his driver, didn't bring his security. He knocked on a door with peeling blue paint and waited. Annika's mother answered, broom in hand. She froze when she saw him. "You're him," she said, "the one from TV." Marcus didn't smile. "I just came to see her world." Annika sat cross-legged on the floor, tinkering with a broken desk fan, wires spread across a cracked plastic tray. She looked up when she saw him, then back down at her project. "I was gonna fix that next," she said, nodding toward an old radio on the table. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You think I can't?" She handed him a screwdriver. "Try." The apartment was small, no real furniture, just stacked crates and makeshift shelves. But it was alive. The walls were covered in hand-sketched diagrams, the floor scattered with half-open devices, DVD players, game controllers, dead batteries in a jar labeled "Try Again." He sat on a pillow, fumbling with the radio. His hands felt stiff, rusty, like his body had forgotten what it meant to tinker. Annika didn't help. She just watched. Not with impatience, with expectation. As if this, too, was part of the test. A boy ran through the room yelling about burnt pancakes. Annika called back without looking up. "Only burnt if you use the front burner." "Told you." Marcus blinked. "He yours?" "Kind of," she said. "He sleeps here." That explained the mattress behind the door, the second toothbrush, the pile of socks in a corner crate. Everyone here had made do. Everything had been repurposed. Marcus looked around again. This wasn't a home. It was a lab, a school, a mind turned outward into a space that never expected it. He watched her explain voltage drop to the boy using the paper clips and a slice of bread, and he finally understood. Annika hadn't found Aegis. She'd simply grown too brilliant for it to ignore. Marcus didn't leave right away. He sat in the corner of that tiny apartment as daylight faded, watching Annika talk her cousin through the basics of pulse width modulation, using a broken LED flashlight. No slides, no lectures. Just curiosity. Her cousin, Mario, protested every other minute. "This is dumb," he grumbled when the breadboard wouldn't light up. "You're not dumb," Annika replied without missing a beat. "You're just not looking at the signal right." That was her way. No scolding, no condescension, just persistence. Marcus couldn't remember the last time someone had taught like that, without ego, without performance. She wasn't trying to prove anything. She just believed people could learn, even if they did in single quotes yet. Later, while Mario dug into a plate of nearly black pancakes and their mother fixed a flickering kitchen light with a rolled-up dish towel and a screwdriver, Annika sat beside Marcus on the floor. She handed him a slip of notebook paper. It had a drawing on it, more circuit loops, but this time with scribbled pancakes in the margins and a smiling stick figure holding a resistor. "I figured out a way to store power without a battery," she said, "using charge delay capacitors." He stared at the paper, and again, he had no words. How do you respond to a child who has reimagined electricity and breakfast on the same page? He folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his pocket like it was something sacred, because it was the next morning, before anyone arrived at Aegis HQ. Marcus was already at his desk. Alone. No calendar, no coffee. Just the weight of everything he'd seen the night before. He looked down at the circuit drawing. Then he opened the internal policy board. He rewrote the internship rules, erased age restrictions, deleted the GPA filter, removed accredited institution from the requirements list, portfolio optional, interview not required. He didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for legal. He was the final signature. Then, he reached out to the legal team, not to protect Aegis from liability, but to establish something permanent, the Annika Grant, a scholarship, but not for Ivy League prodigies or top-tier test scorers, for kids like Annika, kids no one was looking for, brilliant minds hiding in overlooked places. He thought that would be enough, but it wasn't, not for him. Because something still felt unfinished. It wasn't about the program or the money. It was about her, about what she gave them, what she gave him without even trying. He needed her to know it mattered. So he called her mother again. No assistant. No gatekeeper. Just his voice on the other end of the line. This time, when they arrived at Aegis, Marcus didn't take them to the lab or a waiting room. He took them to the room, the boardroom, where billion-euro contracts were signed, where nations negotiated infrastructure terms, where the walls carried weight. He wanted her to know the space belonged to her, too. Annika didn't flinch. She sat at the head of the table like she belonged there. Her mother sat beside her, one hand wrapped tightly around her purse strap like it was the only stable thing in the room. Marcus cleared his throat more than once. Then finally spoke. "You changed the way we see things here." He wasn't reading from a statement. He didn't rehearse this. "This company," he continued, "was built to find talent, to build systems, to solve problems. But none of us saw what was in front of us. Until you." Her mother tried to respond, but choked on a sob. Her head lowered as she wiped her eyes with a trembling hand. Marcus looked at Annika again. "I've made some changes," he said. "There's a mentorship program, one-on-one. You'll have access to the labs, equipment, people who'll help not get in your way." Annika listened, eyes still, expression unreadable. He added, gently, "You'll be part of the team, if you want that." She looked at her mother. Then back at Marcus. Then asked, quiet and clear, "Will I still be allowed to break things?" It wasn't a joke. It wasn't sass. It was her trying to understand the terms. Because breaking things, that's how she learned. If this was going to work, she needed to know they wouldn't try to tame her. Marcus didn't blink. He smiled. "A real one. The kind that didn't come easy anymore." "Yes," he said. "That's how we find out what's inside." Annika's mother exhaled a sound so full of relief and disbelief it barely registered as human. She cried quietly, her shoulders shaking. Annika didn't rush to comfort her. She just reached across the table and held her hand. That was enough. That afternoon, Marcus returned to his office with red eyes and no shame. He placed Annika's latest drawing in a frame on his desk. Not the digital copy, the real one. Smudges and all. When board meetings dragged or press calls blurred into static, he looked at it. And remembered what it felt like to see the world bend, not from force, but from understanding. Annika didn't become a press story. Not really. She avoided interviews, declined TV appearances. The one time a reporter asked for a quote, she shrugged and said, "I like the problem." That was it. No slogans. No brand. Just a quiet girl with a notebook and a question no one else thought to ask. At Aegis, she became a fixture. Her hoodie still too big, her badge now clipped to her collar. Engineers brought her snacks. Interns asked for her thoughts. Department heads paused outside her workstation just to see. But she didn't perform. She just worked.